up into a couple things. First, I'll tell you a little bit about what I have been doing over this past year. Then we'll talk a little bit about the ACA, Affordable Care Act. We'll talk a little bit about the government shutdown and then where we're going from here. So let's first talk about what I've been doing for you prior to the government shutdown, which I think is the key. You know, I was actually named to the Ways and Means Committee, which is, as Dean said, one of the most powerful committees in Washington. And I'm very happy to be there because Ways and Means actually touches about everything there is in government, but most importantly, tax reform. And quite frankly, if we're ever going to get back to jobs and the creation of jobs and making sure that our economy is growing, we're going to have to reform taxes. When we talk about reforming taxes, if you think about it, we are the highest tax nation in the world. We tax at 35% in the corporate rate. There is no other country that taxes that high, their corporations. And so when people say, well, why are these companies going overseas? And it's because of labor, and it's because of cheap labor overseas. Well, a lot of people don't realize, and the National Manufacturing Association has come out with this, it is 20% cheaper to go and move your company outside this country. 10% at a minimum in taxes. It could be greater, because the next highest rate in this world is 25%, that's Japan. So it's 10% cheaper, plus 10% more in regulations. So we have to do something to reform our tax code. We have to make sure that people are willing to bring back dollars when these companies are earning overseas. And we have to look at that. So one of the things that we've done in Ways and Means, and I give the chairman of the committee, Dave Camp, Michigan, a lot of credit for this. He set up bipartisan groups early in the beginning of this year to start looking at issues like international tax, small business, energy, all the things related to tax reform. And that's been our goal for this past year. We've had meeting after meeting after meeting with stakeholders and people talking about 401k plans and small businesses and all the things related to tax reform. So that has definitely been on my plate for most of this year since I've been on Ways and Means. The other thing, I serve on 2 committees on Ways and Means. One of those is Social Security, and as we all know, Social Security is another big issue we have to take a look at. Social Security, if we do nothing, I think it's 2023, don't hold me to that date, 2023 Social Security recipients will only be able to get about 75% of their benefits because 10,000 people a day are retiring for the first time last year. 10,000 people a day are retiring, and they're going and of course applying for Social Security. The system was set up 43 plus years ago. It was, and keep in mind that when the system was set up, it was based on people dying at age 65. So now you know that most people, the survival rate is much past 65. And one of the problems is we have to reform it, not eliminate it. We have to reform it. We have to make sure it's around for everybody, especially future generations. But we can't just leave it stay as the status quo. So I'm on that committee. The other committee that I serve on is employee benefits. We're looking at pension plans, pension plan reform, and 401k plans and many of the benefit plans there. So ultimately what I've been doing on that committee is really going to touch every one of us here in the future, and ultimately it's going to help strengthen where we go with the economy and jobs and job growth. The Affordable Care Act, another big issue that I know a lot of people, it rolled out October 1st. Quite frankly, many people know there are a lot of glitches in the system. Think about the Affordable Care Act. Affordable Care Act, everybody thought it was going to be affordable. One of the problems that has occurred with the Affordable Care Act is people are finding out that as premiums are being rolled out, they're much, much higher than they were anticipated. The Ways and Means Committee has information that was submitted to all of our members. The average premium across the country, will go up 27%. That's the average premium. Now you got to remember, when the president came out with this in 2008 and 2009, he said the premiums will go down. And of course, that's one of the problems. The premiums are not going down, they're going up. The other thing that I think is interesting about the Affordable Care Act is that the president has, of course, given out so many waivers. And that's another problem. I mean, the system appears not to be working. And the reason I'm talking a little bit about this is because it's going to lead into the government shutdown. We waived a number of people, including members of Congress, including even the president himself. does not have to be part of the Affordable Care Act. And I think that's something that the American people should be very upset over. So these waivers have been passed out, and of course we all know that it was just a few weeks ago that the president said that he's going to waive small businesses from having to be part of the Affordable Care Act. So he gave the businesses a 1-year delay in having to be part of the Affordable Care Act. Now, I can tell you anybody sitting in this room should be saying, wow, if Congress doesn't have to do it, if the president doesn't have to be part of it, if business doesn't have to be part of it, why do individuals have to be a part of it? And that was one of the biggest issues as we got down to looking at what we could do to at least slow down this process. And that's what somewhat led to the government shutdown. Now look, blame can go all around for the government shutdown. You know, there was concern within the Republican Party on how to handle it and what to do. We had a president who, quite frankly, said time and time again, I'm not going to negotiate. And of course, we had Harry Reid, who kept tossing out everything that we sent over to him and just saying, I'm not going to pay attention to it. Now, look, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, whatever you are, if you have to sit across the table and negotiate with somebody, and one person says, I'm not going to negotiate, the other person says, I don't care what you send over, I'm going to ignore it, that's a problem. So if you look at what happened during the period prior to the shutdown, again, I will not tell you that there might have been some overreach by the Republicans when the Republicans said, let's look at defunding the President's Health Care Plan, the Affordable Care Act. Quite frankly, I said from the beginning that defunding was almost an impossibility. It's the law. And quite frankly, because it's law and because it's mandatory, even if you defund it, you're only defunding a small portion of it. The law, the piece that's the law, is going to continue to go on. So I was somewhat concerned about that. But ultimately, we went down a path with the first vote that said we wanted to fund it. But let's look at what happened after that. We had 8 or 10 more proposals that were sent over to Harry Reid and the president. And what's most concerning was the final proposal. And I don't know, that's why I said sometimes unless you're living it, believe me, I was just a normal citizen for 30 years trying to operate all these businesses and really wasn't paying attention as much as I should have to the government. When you're in it every day, and believe me, even my wife, she'll call me and say, I can't believe what you guys just did. I go, that's not true. I mean, you almost have to be there every day to figure out what's really happening. So ultimately, we kept sending proposals over to the Senate. Now, if you were paying attention, when we sent a proposal over to the Senate, the president would ultimately come out and say, I'm not negotiating, I'm going to veto that if it gets to me. And Harry Reid, the head of the Senate, was basically ignoring it. Now, I don't know if anybody was following it, but if you found out that the last proposal we sent to him was, you'd be shocked that they ignored it, because the last proposal we sent to him was this. We said, okay, let's delay the individual mandate for 1 year. You've already delayed it for business. You've already said that Congress doesn't apply to it. You've already said that you, Mr. President, don't have to comply with it. Let's delay the individual mandate for 1 year. That doesn't mean stop it from going forward. If everybody, and this is the one thing a lot of people don't understand, delaying the individual mandate just said that if you didn't sign up, you're not penalized. It didn't say you couldn't sign up. It didn't say the individual programs didn't continue. It didn't say the rollout couldn't continue. It just said you wouldn't be penalized. And that went to the Senate the night before we shut the government down, and the Senate ignored it, and the president said he would veto it anyway. Now, if you think about that, folks, that's a real problem. Because the only other thing we added to it was let's go to Congress and determine what's our next step. So I was a little shocked after voting almost 12 times to keep the government open, to make sure we didn't go into default, that we ultimately had a president and Harry Reid, head of the Senate, say, no, we're not going to accept any of these proposals. Then let's look what happened after that. We had government shutdown, and we started to put out pieces that were problematic. You know, the VA, let's make sure we pay our military. Let's make sure the VA is covered. Let's make sure all these other pieces are covered. And what do we get back? We're not going to do that. We're not going to do piecemeal. Now, if you think about it, what a lot of people don't realize is the government does approve piecemeal. They're called appropriations bills. But a lot of people aren't aware of that, because all you keep hearing about is CRs. Now, CR is a continuing resolution. You know what a CR is? It's a failure of the federal government to do its job. CR started in 2008. Prior to 2008, there weren't CRs. There were appropriation bills and budgets passed. But in 2008, during the President's administration, when Harry Reid had the Senate, and when Nancy Pelosi was the Speaker of the House, they couldn't put a budget together and they couldn't get appropriation bills passed. So they decided to do a CR, a continuing resolution. And you know what that means? That means you give the President of the United States complete control of what's spent up to a certain limit. And you don't have any input on any of the other areas. That's a failure of the federal government, and you all should be unhappy with that, as I am. So when we started putting out these mini appropriations, you heard the other side, or you heard the media say, look at these guys, they're doing all these mini appropriations, they're doing all... Guess what, folks? That's what's supposed to happen. That's exactly what's supposed to happen. But what happened was, Harry Reid dug in, says we're not going to even look at them. And the President said, I'm going to veto every one of them. Now, as we went through those 12 days, we ended up getting closer and closer to raising the national debt, or not raising the national debt. And ultimately, I don't know if everybody knows what the final proposal was to the President before the debt ceiling date, which was last Wednesday. But actually, the final proposal that was rejected 100% by the President was, we'll raise the national debt to January 15th. We'll raise the seat, we'll allow the continuing resolution to continue to January 15th. But Mr. President, you're going to have to go on Obamacare. And all members of Congress, excluding their staffs, are going to have to go on the President's health care plan. And I don't know how many people were paying attention, but the President came right out and said, if that comes across my table, I'm going to veto it. And Harry Reid said, we're not going to even bring it up in the Senate. So if you look at what's happened over the last 12 days, clearly we have a government that's dysfunctional. But it's dysfunctional because we have members saying, I'm not going to listen, I'm not going to negotiate, I'm not going to work with you. Now, how do we get to that point? I think that's pretty important, because people will say, well, has this happened in the past? Sure, it's happened in the past. But here's where we're a little bit different in the last 2.5 years since I've been in Congress. There are 233 members of Congress that are Republicans. That's in the House. And there are 202 members that are Democrats. You need 217 members to get anything passed. So keep that in mind. This is pretty important, because I never really figured this out until for the last 2.5 years. So if the minority side all stands together and says no, that means you need 217 out of 233 of the majority to get anything done. Now, quite frankly, there are always going to be 25 people on both sides that disagree. But the one thing on the minority side, it's pretty easy to all stand together and say no. And that's what was so frustrating for me, because many of you know, if I spoke to you, if you heard my speeches, I actually work with many members of the other side. I have a bipartisan group. I have just as many friends on the Democrat side as I have on the Republican side. And when we would talk, they would say, you know, there's at least 30 or 40 people that would go along with you guys. Great. Shove, and when the vote comes forward, they all end up voting no. And you look at them and you'll say, why'd you vote no? You were in a meeting with me and you said that it was reasonable. And their answer is, well, you got to understand, we got a lot of pressure from leadership. That's the problem. If you want to know why we have a dysfunctional government, people need to vote what's right. They don't need to vote what their leadership says. And I blame the minority party now, and I blame the Republicans when they were in a minority too. Because the minority party holds together and all votes no all the time. They force the majority party to always vote and pass things. So what you're seeing, because we have a very close divided government, especially in the House, you're seeing a problem that it's very tough to get 217 votes. Now people will say to me, well, how come that didn't happen back in the early days? Well, I actually went back and looked. I was wondering the same thing. How come that didn't happen in some of the days, 20, 25 years ago? Well, if you go back, you're going to see that when, in many cases, when the Democrats had the control of the House, they had 295 members. So you could lose 50 members, 60 members, and still get something passed. But the other thing that happened back then is you used to have some of the minority party that was willing to do what's right. That's the most difficult thing I can tell you about being in Washington, is we always have the minority party. Again, today it's the Democrats, in the past it's the Republicans. But you always have the minority party. If they stand together and don't vote on good pieces of legislation, it's going to always take 217 members of the majority party to get something done. So that's one of the issues that I think is important. Where do we go from here? You know, I think that's probably one of the most important things. Where do we go from here? Because let's face it, things haven't changed. I mean, we had a president who came out the other day and said, hey, if you want to make changes, win elections. What he doesn't realize is the Republicans did win elections in the House. So that's really not the right thing to say either. The answer is, if you want to get some things done, let's work together. Let's figure out a way to come up with things that are winnable and really are that the majority of the American people want to get things done. So when I go back to the Affordable Care Act, you know, 57% of the people don't like the Affordable Care Act. All right, 57. That means that 43% do like it. I understand that. And that's the problem, because when I run into people, they'll say, I like the Affordable Care Act. And I'll say, really? It's great. Tell me why. Well, because it covers my son or daughter until they're 26, and it eliminates pre-existing conditions. You know, and it does. And I said, that's great. I agree with you. Those are the things we need to fix. The problem is, what's it doing to us? And where's it taking business owners? I mean, I just had a business come to me and say their health care plan just got renewed for 62%. 62% increase. Now, if you think about it, a 62% increase means somebody's not going to get a raise, somebody's not going to get paid, or somebody's not going to get employed. And those are the kind of things that we need to look at. I told you the average across the country is 27. I got to tell you, when I went around the district prior to the shutdown, and I don't say this, you know, people say, well, you know, you're not talking to the right people. 8 out of 10 people said they were unhappy with what's going on with the Affordable Care Act. So what do we need to do? And I said this 30 days ago, let's let it go. Let's let it find its way, because I think as it gets out, people are going to be unhappy with it. We're hearing that more and more. You want to know what one of the biggest failures of the Affordable Care Act will be? It's going to be that you don't have the individual mandate. You know, an individual like my son, he's 25 years old. He used to be able to get insurance for $100 a month. Now it's going to be $300 and something. He doesn't have to buy that insurance. It's only going to cost him $95 for a penalty. So a lot of people are just going to pay the penalty. Think about how bad that is. Think about that situation. Do I pay $2,500 a year, or do I pay $95 and pay the penalty? That's a real bad thing when you can say that you have a plan that's too expensive to get into, but it only costs you $95 to pay the penalty to get out. That's one problem we're going to find with the Affordable Care Act. The other problem we're going to find with the Affordable Care Act, and you're all hearing about it and seeing it, is they've spent millions and billions of dollars to put a system together, and it's failing. And it's failing, and that's the sign-up system. So think about that. You now have to sign up between now and December 31st. And if you can't sign up, you're going to be penalized $95. I don't know how many people in this room think that's fair, but I doubt it that I'd get a hand from anybody if I asked you this way. Do you think if you can't get on a program that the government requires you to get on, and you're not able to get through the system, that you should be penalized $95 for not being able to get on? That's a real issue too. And the last thing I would tell you about the Affordable Care Act, which I think, if you really get down to the details, and by now most of you know that, Affordable care just means that a business really only has to cover their employee. They don't have to cover their spouse or their children anymore. If you're not aware of that, look at the law. That's what the Affordable Care Act says. The other thing the Affordable Care Act says is that you're actually able to charge 9% to that employee for that premium, for being on that health insurance. So if you start to look around at your plans that are out there and say, wow, if I had to pay 9% of what I was making to be on a health care plan that only covered myself and doesn't cover my spouse or my children, is it really affordable? That's why I said all along, let's let it play out. Because I think in the long run, most people are going to find that there are problems and that it's going to have to be changed. Now, are there some things that we need to take a good look at for the future? And I've always said, anybody that's seen me talk about health care, yeah, absolutely. We do need health care reform, but we don't need health care reform that drives up costs. We don't need health care reform that eliminates the ability to employ people, and we don't need health care reform that's driving us to become a part-time nation. You know, there's one study out there that shows 7 out of 8 new jobs that have come out since the Affordable Care Act was announced in 2010, because people have been preparing for it. You know, the easy answer is, oh, it's not even in effect yet, and you're blaming it. Well, look, I was a business owner. I would prepare for it. All of you that are business owners, I guarantee you're preparing for it. You prepare for it by getting ready. I was at a business a couple weeks ago who said to me, I have 48 employees. I'm not adding anymore. I could grow my business. I'm just not going to have it. So what are they doing? They're not under the Affordable Care Act yet, but they're preparing. All right, I've been to other businesses who have said, you know what? I'm just going to hire part-time. I'm just going to bring all part-time people in. That's another one of the problems. So these are the issues we're seeing. So as I said, let it roll out. I think the American people will find that they're going to want to repeal it in the next year after they see what's happening with the cost. And if not, so be it, because I do believe that the American people, when it comes down to it, when they get all the information and when they get all the facts, they really do go along with what's right. So that's why I'll tell you, you know, some people, one of your questions might be, why did I vote? I actually voted no last week. I was one of the Republicans that voted no. Right away I was called the Tea Party, you know, crazy, and all the things you want to call me because I voted no. But let me tell you one thing that I'm dead set on about being in Washington. I'm not for default, and I'm not for shutting down the government, but I am definitely not for status quo. And if you sent me down there for status quo, you sent the wrong person down. If we don't change things in Washington, if we don't learn that we can't spend more than we're bringing in, if we don't realize that we can't increase the national debt to $17 trillion in the last 5 years, if we don't realize that all we're doing is taking money from our children and our grandchildren, if we don't realize that that's a problem, then we're all going to have problems in 5, 6, 7, 10, 15 years. Medicare, you know, there's nobody that wants to make sure Medicare is strengthened more than me. But quite frankly, I also know that Medicare will be bankrupt in 23 years. So why don't we fix it? Why don't we make the changes necessary to fix it? And why do we continue with status quo? Here's what we did. We voted for something. We extended it for 10 weeks. Now think about that. Would any of you do that in your business? Would any of you do that? Would you tell your child, just extend it for 10 weeks and don't worry about it? We just extended something for 10 weeks, and guess what's going to happen in 10 weeks? And by the way, folks, those 10 weeks included a week of Christmas, a week for Thanksgiving, and another week that we have recess. So that those 10 weeks are probably only 6 weeks. So in 6 weeks, we're going to have to come back and make another decision. Now, in my world, and all of your worlds, which I'm sure, because I was in your world for 30 years, I've only been down here for 2.5, we would have got it done before we ever took that vote. And that's why I voted no. Because, quite frankly, I'm not going to vote for the status quo. We need to fix things. We need to move things along. And by the way, so how do we fix it? Probably none of you saw that I was on national TV with a Democrat from Maryland, John Delaney. John Delaney and I actually came up with a plan. And we said, this is a plan that should work. We should extend the debt ceiling till June of next year. We should open up the government until June of next year. But we should require that Social Security is reformed, and we should require that our tax system is reformed by June 30th of next year. And in the meantime, we should go back to our budgets, and we should make sure that all of our budgets come together in budget conference. And we should all be required to do the appropriations bills that the government's required to do. Isn't that a novel idea? Because all we really said was, we should go back and do what we're required to do anyway. And if we do that, and if we follow those rules, We should open the government back up, and we should raise the debt ceiling, because now we're going to be forced to come together in a room and get some things done. And I think that was truly the answer. That's where we should be going. And I hope that what John Delaney and I put forward on national TV, of course you probably never saw it because that's not news. You know, a Republican and Democrat working together is never news in Washington. But that should have been on every news station possible to show there are people out there that are willing to work together. And by the way, it just wasn't John and I. There were many other members who agreed to that. It was just the two of us that went on because it was part of my bipartisan group. And that's where we need to grow. So Washington, we need to do that. Now let me explain what we need to do back home, because I think this is the other piece. Because it's not just Washington. Washington's broken, there's no doubt about it. But it gets fueled in many cases by us back home. And let me explain a story, and then I'll open up for questions. You know, I got on the airplane the other day, was flying back to D.C., and I wasn't in a suit and tie, and I didn't have this pin on, so nobody knew who I was. And I was sitting next to a woman who was just complaining about the federal government. Just absolutely complaining about the federal government. And I was just sitting there, it was a Sunday, I was just trying to pay attention to the Browns game. And finally I looked over at her and I said, ma'am, I said, I got to say something to you. I said, you can complain all you want. I said, but you're sitting next to a U.S. Congressman. I said, so, if you're going to complain, please keep it a little quiet so I can watch the game. And she said, oh. And this is a defining moment of where I say we need to fix things back home. She said, are you a Republican or a Democrat? I said, I'm a Republican. And she went off. That is the problem with this country. You Republicans, you hate women. You don't like Social Security. You hate old people. I'm telling you, she was as loud as could be on a plane. And I'm going, man, calm down. I said, because number one, you don't know me. You don't know what I stand for. You don't know what I believe in. You don't know anything about me. But you have just attacked me verbally because I'm a Republican. So we spent the next 35 minutes talking. I told her what I believed in. I told her where my family came from. I told her I was a Democrat at one point in time. I told her I didn't believe in some of the things that Democrats believe in today. But that doesn't mean I can't work with them. They probably don't believe in everything I do. But quite frankly, I believe we're all Americans. These aren't Democrat problems. These aren't Republican problems. These are American problems. So we need to work together to get them done. Here's what I believe in. I believe in fiscal responsibility. I believe in all the other, some of the social issues that are very important to me, but right now it's jobs and the economy. Let's make sure we're working on those things. And man, the number one thing we need is quit calling each other names. And she looked at me and says, you know what? I can vote for you. She says, in fact, I believe in you, and I'm going to support you. She goes, I didn't know that about you. Once you said you were a Republican, I was shocked. And she says, I apologize. I tell you that story because that's where we need to go back home to. We need to quit the name calling. You know, if you think about it, Harry Reid shouldn't be calling Republicans anything, and there should be no name calling. We should be working as Americans to get things done. That has to be our goal. In Washington, we need to work together. Back home, we need to work together too. With that, I'll open it up for questions.
How are you going to get the Republicans to work together?
Well, keep in mind, Republicans, everybody thinks Republicans disagree. If you were in Congress, you'd find out Democrats disagree too. But let me tell you what the Republicans don't disagree that we're spending too much money. The Republicans don't disagree that we have too much debt. The Republicans don't disagree that the President's health care plan is bad and is not liked by 60% of Americans. What Republicans disagree is on a strategy. That's the problem. Actually, the policies we all agree on. Whether you agree with Ted Cruz or don't agree with Ted Cruz, Ted Cruz believes that Obamacare is bad, well, so do the rest of the Republicans. Did I believe his strategy was right? No. So what we need to start doing as Republicans back in Washington is start realizing that we're all fighting for the same thing. Less debt, less spending. We don't like the Affordable Care Plan. We do like tax reform. We do like to get back to regular order. We do like appropriations bills. We do like budgeting. So let's get back to a strategy that gets us there. That's what we need to do, and I think that's what we're going to have to work on going forward.
When I knew you 4 years ago, you were very idealistic going into this for basically the same reasons you still have today. How is your ability to do find that frustrating, or has it changed your view being over in Washington versus sitting over here? What's your take on it?
Sure. Well, the question is, what are my thoughts? Because 4 years ago I had a businessman's perspective 4 years ago, and today I have to understand that after being there for 2.5 years, that it's a whole different world out there. So what you have to do is you have to realize it's a different world. We've got to remember, in the business world, whether you're in a car dealership, you're in a nursing home, whatever you're in, you have to figure out a way to make it work. And there's going to be disagreements, but everybody gets on the same team. The difference in a business world is you can say this is the policy and this is the goal of all of us, and then everybody gets together and tries to follow that. In Congress, you can say this is the goal. By the way, there are a lot of Democrats that are friends of mine, and a lot that I wouldn't even consider close friends, that do agree we're spending too much and our debt's too high. Now, by the way, there are some, which I would call the far left, that believe our government's not big enough, our debt's half of what it should be, we should continue to build and spend more money. That's the far left. But there are a lot of people that do agree of the vision. We're spending too much, our debt's too high, we're passing this on to our children and grandchildren, and the goal has to be, in my mind, just like whether it was in a nursing home, car business, whatever, is come together with a common goal. And that's why I'm so adamant about the bipartisan working group. In fact, we go back this week, Thursday morning, we have another bipartisan working group that we need to make sure we're moving forward together. And ultimately, everybody needs to know, one of the things I'm working on that also really drives me to realize that many people in Congress don't know everything they should know. I mean, I look at it from a business perspective. When I first took over, you heard that I ran over 60 businesses. When I took over a business, what's the first thing I looked at? Balance sheet, financial statement. Do you realize that the federal government today doesn't have a balance sheet? Think about it. Do you realize that the federal government today doesn't have a balance sheet? Now, President Clinton, I'll give him credit for this, said we need to set up a balance sheet. But there was so much disagreement on how to set it up, they set up another organization. We all back home have to live with either FASB or government accounting standards. But in Washington, they set up a whole other entity that decides how financial statements are set up. So I'm an advocate of changing that. You're going to hear about this when I get back because it got slowed down during this shutdown. But I'm such an advocate of making sure the American people see a balance sheet and that all members of Congress, when you walk in the door as a member of Congress, the first thing you should get is a balance sheet of the United States of America. Because here's what you find. You find that our debt's not 17 trillion. It's probably closer to 90 trillion. Probably closer to 90 trillion. So when you think 17 trillion is a big number, just think how big it is when you talk about 90. Now, why does anybody want to talk about that? Well, there's political reasons. Boy, if we say we've got 90 trillion, everybody's going to be concerned. These are the kind of things we have to do. So I still keep my business background and try and use it to the benefit of getting people on both sides to realize we need to move forward and do the right thing for Americans.
I still don't understand the no votes at the end of the government shutdown. Could you explain that further?
Oh, absolutely. That was one of the easiest votes I could take. Because if we're going to close the government down for 12 days, and we're going to say that we're just going to leave it status quo, everything's going to just be extended for 20 weeks, and we're not going to fix the drivers of the debt, which are the entitlement programs, our spending, and the budget, we're not going to do that, then we should be still in that room figuring out what's right for the American people. So if you're happy that we just pushed everything off for 20 weeks, then you would want me to vote for a yes vote. But if you're saying, I sure don't like that all you guys did was push it off for 20 weeks, and by the way, 10 weeks, and by the way, that 10 weeks is probably 6 weeks, then I think you would defend renewal. So the question is, do you think we should be on status quo, or do you think we have to change things? We had a lot of time in that room, believe me. If you were sitting down in Washington with me that last day, you'd have found out we were sitting around waiting. I believe we should have been sitting around fighting for the American people. Wait about it.
What was the purpose of Homeland Security's purchase of ammunition for the last 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq?
The question was, what was the purpose of the purchase of ammunition by Homeland Security? You know, that came up because, it's interesting, some of these things hit the web or they hit the Facebook and then it becomes viral and people say, wow, we're spending too much money on ammunition. So we actually looked, I actually had my staff look, we're not buying any more ammunition than we've done in the past. They always buy in bulk. be cheaper because they know they're going to be spending it for training or whatever. And the purchases that they made were no larger than purchases in the past. That's why I said you always have to be careful. And believe me, I tell my wife this all the time. You have to be careful what you hear on TV or you hear on the radio, because sometimes you have to get all the information.
Congressman, I sell health insurance for a living every day, so what you do in Washington affects me almost hourly. I do have a question. I agree with you on the pricing of the premiums going forward. But my question is on the subsidy that will be helping to offset that for people. How will the government afford those subsidies? And once people have that amount of money, because it's substantial if you get on the subsidy calculators, what people will get to offset it. How will we ever get that bus turned around so we're not in that situation again? And also, my second question then is, when you have a party that's not willing to negotiate, how is Congress proposing to negotiate 10 weeks from now?
Well, all those are great questions. I would tell you, if you think about it, if we're already spending too much money and our debt's already too high, the subsidies are going to cost the federal government money. I mean, let's face it, they're going to cost the government money. So that's why the CBO has now come out and said that the president's health care plan is actually going to cost the federal government more money. And I think those are things we're going to have to look at. Because quite frankly, we don't have the dollars to do that. When it comes to your second, so that was the question on what are we going to do with subsidies and why, and how we're going to pay for subsidies, because that is an important question. Subsidies are going to be coming out of the federal budget. The second question was?
But with subsidies, once people start to get that money, and if it's not there, how is that going to get turned around? How are people, you going to take it away from them? Or are we just going to keep going further and further in debt? And that's part of the subsidy question. But the other part of the question then is, as far as negotiating with a president who won't negotiate, how is Congress going to get anything done going forward?
Well, the subsidies too, keep in mind that as subsidies are paid out, you're right, they're coming out of the federal government. That's one of the reasons why we like to look at this a little closer before it's totally implemented, because once those subsidies kick in, you know, that they become permanent as an entitlement, and that's a real problem. And by the way, folks, if you listen and you really start to see, some of the people thought they were going to get health insurance for free. And most people are finding out that affordable health care means you're going to go on health care, you're going to get a subsidy, but it's still going to cost you. And those people are now up in arms too, saying, I thought I was going to get it for nothing. Next question was, what are we going to do in 10 weeks different than we did today? That goes back to the question I had over here. What are we going to do in 10 weeks that we did different today? That's a problem. I think that's one of the reasons why I voted no. We need to sit down in a room and fix it now. Now, if you think about it, we pushed everything to January. Guess why January 15th? It's after Christmas. Can you imagine making, I sat in my business office December 24th at 10 o'clock at night because I had a problem. Or I sat in my business office New Year's Eve until 11:30 at night while my wife was ready to crucify me because I wasn't home yet, trying to get a business deal done. And yet, we pass and push it past December 31st. So I do have a problem. I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm hoping that they start looking at some of the bipartisan ideas like John Delaney and I have put out. And I think that's got to be the key.
There's been a lot written about the polarization in Congress. Recently, I read an article that said that the center is growing, even though it may not be readily apparent. What do you see?
Well, I think the center is starting to finally realize that the far left and the far right don't run the country, yet they do because they control so many votes. So I do believe that's what's happening is what we really need is not to call people center, we need to call people reasonable. The more reasonable people are going to win out. You know, there are a lot of people that are fiscal conservatives that are Democrats. There are a lot of liberal Democrats. I had one on my committee who's a liberal Democrat, but he's fiscally responsible. So think about that. So when you get to reasonableness, if we could just get everybody together to start talking about fiscal issues, jobs, economy, growing the the economy so people are working, getting the unemployment rate down. Where if we just all focused on that as reasonable people, we could probably get a whole lot accomplished. And by the way, one thing that you have to realize in Washington, some people go down there, they were either staff members, this is both sides too, Republicans and Democrats. They were staff members of Congress people who were there for 30 years. So think about it, they have never really had to live within the real world. And then they become the congressperson, Democrats and Republicans. There are people that have never really had a job, had to live within the rules, that they came right out of college and went right into politics. I'm a firm believer. The reason that I feel I'm reasonable is because I understand what it is to live within the rules that Congress makes, because I had to do it for 28 and a half years. And it sure is a lot different when I look at things than it is when somebody who has never had to live with those rules. So I think what we need to do is make sure everybody becomes more reasonable. We start to throw the Democrat and Republican hats off and call it the reasonable caucus, and we can get reasonable people from all areas and do what's right for America. That's got to be. Probably have one more question. You've already got it. Was anybody else?
How do the Republicans fix their strategy? I mean, to not be so seen as anti-women, anti-this, I mean, what's your opinion on that?
It's kind of good. Look, people love, like again, politics is not something I was ever used to prior to 2.5 years. When I was mayor, I know the mayor's here, when you're running for mayor, you don't have this personal attacks on you and your family. And I mean, people love this. They think they find one little thing about you, and then they blow it up into this major thing that really didn't occur. I mean, look, I was called a criminal. I was called everything. Never was a criminal. I mean, but those are the kind of things that happen. So what we have to do from a Republican standpoint is just keep getting out like I'm doing today and talking about reasonableness, talking about strategy. I mean, we don't want to eliminate Medicare and Medicaid. We want to make sure it's around forever. If we do nothing, by the way, folks, if we do nothing, it's gone. Believe it or not, Medicare, Social Security will end up being in its own demise if we do nothing, because the system's not set up to continue forever, because it was based on principles that don't exist today. That doesn't mean we can't fix it. We should fix it for the future. So those are the kind of things. Look, when we were attacked, when the Republicans were attacked for Social Security and wanted Medicare, and they had the pictures of Paul Ryan pushing grandma off the cliff. You realize that once the American people realized what was going on, they disregarded that 100%, and that became a non-issue, and that's why you never heard about it anymore. I think the goal has to be is people just have to become more informed. They have to be willing to talk to their congressman. If you're a Democrat and you don't like what I'm doing, it doesn't mean you can't talk to me. I may learn something from you, you might learn something from me. I think that's the way we have to do it. We have to move together forward. We have to eliminate that situation where a woman gets into a plane and says, "You're a Republican, or you're horrible," without knowing people. Because I really do think there's some really good people down in Washington. There's some good Democrats, there's some good Republicans, there's some good people that want to get things done. But when we walk out of a room after a meeting, guess where the cameras go to? They go to the fringes. They go to the far left and the far right, and they just put the cameras right in their faces and say, "What do you think about this and what do you think about that?" The American people have to get past all that and go right to the people that are reasonable and start thinking about what's best for America and get some things accomplished. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Congressman, thank you for your time today. Thank you for letting us know some of the information in the past couple of weeks, and we appreciate your efforts and those that are working with you in Congress on both sides of the aisle. In appreciation of your time with us today, I'd like to present you with the Caspian Collectible. It's got the rendition of the Rotary four-way test. It's made here locally. Thanks to all of our guests today. We appreciate you attending, and we hope you'll have a great week. Stay safe. Thank you for your service. We stand adjourned.